Good morning, everybody. I'm going to give everybody a few seconds to kind of filter in before we get started. All right. Got a steady number. How's everybody doing? Good morning and welcome to the Central Carolina Area Agency on Aging February webinar. We're very excited today. Our topic is going to be learned helplessness. Just for those of you who are not familiar, I'm going to go over a couple of Zoom webinar features. So you are automatically muted. You cannot see other participants. You'll be able to see speakers and hosts. And if you have any questions, please feel free to just drop those in the chat box. This is being recorded today and it will be posted on our website. Also, I know this is a big question we get. Yes, you will get a certificate of attendance. Yes, we will email you slides if Debbie says we can. So you'll get all of that information within a week of the webinar. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Miss Debbie Lee. She is our Assistant Director of Aging Programs here at Central Carolina. She's been here for over 30 years and is an amazing resource and a great speaker. And I'm very excited. So I'm going to turn it over.
Oh, golly, my head is too big now to even fit in the little teeny tiny screen on this thing. Good morning, everybody. And I just really appreciate you taking your time, really your valuable time to be with us here at Central Carolina this morning for the webinar series. If you haven't taken time out to look back over some of the prior recordings, do so. It's worth an investment. There've been some amazing people. Today's maybe the exception to that we'll see at the end. Continuing education is really an important investment that you make for yourself and your customers. And so we appreciate you being here. I also really want to say thank you to Caitlin, who is the webmaster for these webinars. She's very instrumental to the success of these monthly offerings. And she's going to be helping me today, advance slides, etc. So Caitlin, if you want to go to that very first slide, it's just the title slide, but it is important for me to note that while I have been doing this for 30 years, I'm not a psychologist. I don't have any specific training in mental health or cognitive behavioral therapy, which we'll be talking about later. But as a 30-year veteran in the field of aging, I've researched, I have a master's in gerontology, and really experienced and heard from the field, from you guys, of the various aspects of learned helplessness, especially during my time as an ombudsman in long-term care facilities. I developed this presentation years ago for that purpose, really revealing the impact of how a helping relationship on residents in long-term care could lead to inadvertently learned helplessness. If somebody comes in and takes over your life and takes care of everything, then there's really not a lot left for you to do or be involved in. And really a reminder that nothing about our mind or personality is simple or easy. There's not a magic wand that I'm going to give you at the end of this to wave over circumstances, and that it takes two for relationships to be developed and built. And as individuals, we all experience and respond to life very differently, depending on just huge factors: background, genetics, cultural development, environmental influences, financial influences. And this review of learned helplessness is really to encourage us all to think about our own processes of responding to difficult situations and how these responses really might influence our readiness to help others who are also going through the same things. So the term helping relationship, which we're going to talk a lot about today, was really coined by Carl Rogers, a humanistic psychologist, and it describes the type of relationship where at least one person in that relationship has the intent to promote growth, development, or improve function or coping of the other person. And what we want to be sure to do is be mindful that our helping relationship doesn't help somebody learn to be helpless. So go ahead and advance this, Caitlin. Perfect. So of course, every good presentation starts with a definition, right? What is learned helplessness? What the heck is that? And since the early 60s, psychologists have been studying why dependent behaviors are created. What is it about life and circumstances that leads some parts of the population down a road where they feel or perceive that stressful events are beyond their control, whether it be in life or work or personal relationships or domestic, romantic relationships, helping relationships. It's all based on conditioning. And will a person come to believe that they're unable to control or change their situation, or really make no attempt to even try, might be based on some factors that they actually learn or come across along the way. Learned helplessness really affects all parts of life and thinking, feeling, sensing, behaviors, and attitudes, and really leads a person often to isolation and depression. They really lose their ability to even be happy because they've lost a motivation to seek happiness. And so, again, everything from social events, emotional, financial, physical changes, all can happen really at any age and are not a direct result of the aging process or growing older at all. One of the biggest myths of aging is around, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, or you can't learn anything new as you grow older, and none of those things are true. People are already sometimes prone to a high degree of mental, social, emotional fragility, and maybe at just greater risk of adapting or adopting behaviors that are not necessarily in their best interest. So we'll be talking next a little bit about what triggers, and go ahead and advance this, Caitlin, and what leads to learned helplessness, right? What are the things that in life might be happening that results in that? And while it's really not directly known, there are some critical factors that have been identified that can influence really what often is a slow fade into learned helplessness. You've all seen in your client base those individuals who start off what seems to be very excited about something, or have come into a program, or especially a long-term care facility, or even a relationship, say at work, where they're taking on new responsibilities and they seem to be excited. But then something happens. Either they've lost, they have a financial setback and now become a victim of a crime, or they've had a trauma in their life. Maybe it's a childhood abusive situation where they didn't get enough attention or didn't get basic essentials of life. They could have had a stroke or loss in health or physical ability that now puts them in a situation where they don't feel as much in control of their life as before. Widows often have learned helplessness related to the fact that their husband never let them do X, Y, or Z. I talked to somebody yesterday, literally, who knew a woman whose husband never let her pump gas. And so now at 75, when her husband died, she doesn't know how to work a gas pump. She doesn't know how to do any of that. And while not necessarily learned, it is something that if she doesn't learn it, then she may give up on even trying, because she's just wasn't given the opportunity. Many times death of partners or supports can also lead a person down that path. And more times than not, a change in location, whether it be moving in with family members to a new state and leaving your social supports behind, or moving from one environment to another, say independent living to an assisted living, or to a supportive setting, can also be a trigger that might lead a person into thinking that they just don't have as much control over their life as before. And I know it's no surprise to any of us that COVID and the pandemic for the last 24 months had a huge impact on us. So let's go to the next slide. And obviously, some of those impacts result in emotional responses, right? Individuals can become very anxious They can become depressed. They can become isolated. They can have situations where their illnesses become worse, or their financial situation becomes more dire because they're not able to get out and find work, or feel as if they are capable of finding work. A lot of older workers who lose jobs in their 40s or 50s stay unemployed for a long time, or in lower paid jobs, because they don't feel like they can get back into the workforce and don't take advantage of the opportunities that might be available to them to learn new skills. Those all are trends that really have been found to have a negative impact universally on the way we respond to life, and the kinds of things that we may or may not feel like we have control over to take responsibility for our own lives or make a change. Go to the next slide. And this one's a little hard to read. It's not my favorite kind of slide because it's a lot of information, but really pay attention to the two types of colored lines. There's a dark line, and then there's a less dark line. This is a study that was done on the effect of the pandemic, especially as it related to the emotions around social isolation, which are all triggers and potential triggers for learned helplessness. And what the study was looking at was how things like frustration, stress, anxiety, isolation, sadness, I'm getting ready to point at my own computer, which is not helpful, but the list that's on that left-hand side of those lines were experienced by those individuals who were 50 and over, or those individuals who were 18 to 34 years old. And the dark line is the older adult line, and the lighter line is the younger adult line. And as you look down beyond frustration, almost every single category, the younger adults did not fare as well in that survey about how those things impacted life as older adults. Now, does that mean older adults just skipped through the pandemic with no frustration, stress, et cetera? Obviously not. Those lines are very close together, that people overwhelmingly, almost half the people surveyed, obviously in many cases, had experienced frustration, stress, anxiety, et cetera. But it is very telling that the younger generation are more likely to report feeling stressed and isolated since the pandemic began, when the study was done in 2020. And as we sit and ponder that for just a moment, one of the things that we can think about is an idea of what's called resilience. That individuals who are between 18 and 34 are young by definition, right? Chronologically, they've just not experienced or had many years under their belt because they're chronologically young. While an older adult, 50 and over, has experienced life. They have practical experience to be able to think through similar situations. Now, of course, nothing in our experience was similar to COVID, but they've been through times of extreme stress. They've been through times of extreme struggle, or times when they've been separated from family members, possibly during wartime, or tremendous illness, or other types of global impacts. And that sense of resilience is one of the theories that is in place that describes how emotional well-being might be able to be protected over time, because there is a little bit of experience in the bank to draw from, as well as whether or not in general a person thinks about life in a pessimistic fashion or an optimistic fashion. Now, pessimism and optimism is really not how we typically describe that phenomenon. We usually use the example of, are you a glass half full or a glass half empty person? Of course, the glass half empty person is the pessimist. Oh yeah, it's almost empty. If I drink anymore, it's not going to help me out. It's going to be all the way empty in a little bit. And of course, the optimist says, well, gosh, I've got a half full glass. That's great. And then there are those in the realm of big thinkers who say, well, the glass is really all the way full. It has liquid in some and it has air in the other. And so I have a full glass. I have an opportunity to do just about anything with that glass that I want to. And so that sense of how we process life and the impacts that come along with life is a huge part of learned helplessness and the components of flipping or switching from learned helplessness to the alternatives of moving out of that into potential optimism. All right, move to the next one, Caitlin. So in just a little twist that I don't usually add is the impact on the workforce, mainly because we have never really taken the time out to pay attention to the workforce. And I think COVID gave us plenty of examples to try to figure out, because just about every sector of the workforce felt the impact of the lockdown, and certainly millions of people were impacted by closures. There was loads of literature done during that time about the psychological, psychosocial burdens and the overall wellness of different types of sectors in the workforce, whether it be healthcare workers, which were seen as essential workers or heroes in a lot of cases. What was the impact on them in their own health and their own responses to their family, in fulfilling what they always have felt was their mission, to continue to show up to work every day. Plenty of people left that job, obviously, because it was too much for them. But the studies really were looking at ways that the social service delivery system, just like you guys, really stayed in place and pivoted into a different model of delivery. And while we all experienced emotional exhaustion, lack of sleep, fear, worry, client dissatisfaction. Of course, there's always the people who, despite how hard you're working, are going to say, this really sucks and I don't like what you're doing. Pressures from families, especially those who could not get in to see long-term care family members, really led to this overwhelming sense of burnout and an increase really in suicidal thoughts and actual suicides, and the use of drugs or alcohol. I was chatting with a colleague yesterday about an upcoming webinar that's or series that's coming up about alcohol use in older adults, and was never ceased to be amazed that the ABC store was actually considered an essential service during the pandemic. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know that you can buy toilet paper at the ABC store, which is one of the things, or maybe a COVID test. There's just a limited number of products that one can buy at the ABC store, and they're not necessarily all going to be towards somebody's general health and well-being. So it just describes sort of that emphasis that we may put on the different options that are available to us, that we didn't necessarily see this huge increase in mental health opportunities or counseling, or those kinds of support as an essential service. So I just thought that was an interesting perspective. All right, Caitlin. So those who have studied learned helplessness really have sort of focused in on all of these impacts, and whether you have resilience and the types of emotional impact and responses that you've gotten, they've sort of whittled that down to sort of three aspects or of how people deal with setbacks. They deal with it in a very personal way. For those who are experiencing learned helplessness, they say, hey, I'm at fault for the things that happened to me. Doesn't matter what I do, doesn't matter how I respond, doesn't matter what happens. It is all my fault. And there's nothing that I can do personally to make a difference. And that's the seed of resilience is not necessarily planted in that kind of thinking during negative events. The sense that everything that's happening to me is also pervasive, that it's not singular or one instance that this is happening, but that because I can't quit smoking, for instance, or lose weight because I've tried and tried and tried to be on a diet and I can't lose weight, then therefore I never can lose weight, is pervasive. So it doesn't matter if I can't lose weight, that might mean I also can't have a healthy relationship partner, or I can't find the job that I'm looking for, or I can't eat right, or I can't make a change in, I've had this physical thing happen to me and I can't get through that, or I can't get past that. So it's a pervasiveness that no matter what happens, I can't get out of it or get near to people that can help me do anything about it. And then there's also a really tremendous sense of permanence, that the individual who's experiencing that learned helplessness has really no vision for it ever getting better. There's no apparent end in sight. There's no end to the tunnel. There's no hill that I'll eventually get to the top of and it'll be better on the other side. And these responses truly impact our ability as helpers and supporters, because we are trained to be aware of very specific aspects of working with older and disabled adults, and sort of meeting the person where they are and being person-centered. And so often when we're faced with somebody who is just in that place of, it's all my fault, no matter what happens to me, nothing's ever going to get better, and it's always going to be this way, can be some of the most challenging individuals to work with. And our first response might be to, well, let me just take care of everything. Let me make it better for you by creating some positivity in your life. And unfortunately, that may be exactly the opposite of what's helpful. You often need to assist an individual in finding or creating one win a day, one thing that they might be able to control, one positive aspect of life that they can envision and that they can cling to and look to. It doesn't have to be a fix-it, but you're solving their situation is not necessarily a good remedy. And support is not doesn't mean that you take over, or that we supplant their capacity to be in charge of their own life. And we'll come back to these 3 Ps in a few minutes. All right, Caitlin. So most training around aging or helping people with disabilities really focuses, just like we were talking about, on what do we need to know? We obviously need to know about the aging process, what's true and not true about aging, the myths and facts around growing older and what that means. Too many times we hear that, oh, that's just a result of being old, and aging is not an illness. It's not a disease. It is a process that everybody goes through, birth to death. And sort of how we live that life impacts how successful we might be in reaching the life that we envision for ourselves, right? There's genetics that may go into it, that increases our propensity for death. Like if heart disease runs in your family, then you may overcome that and you may not. It's not inevitable. We're also taught to be keen observers and critical thinkers, but then we're faced with crunches in time and finances that don't allow us the opportunity to listen as well as we could to what people are saying, what they need, as well as what they want, the things that are important to them, as well as those things that are important for them, which is part of the person-centered approach to working with individuals. We also are trained to pick up on verbal and nonverbal communication. What is the message behind the message, or empathetic listening? And again, I think the constraints often of our agencies and the demands that are placed on you as service providers can be a challenge. You don't have enough money to do and meet the needs of everybody that you work with. You don't have enough time in the day to address all the issues that you're faced with. And constantly facing that list of priorities with individuals who are challenged in situations that are challenging, and your own impact and emotional response to the circumstances around you all mix in for this really complicated soup of a helping relationship. And it can be extremely difficult for helpers to not just want to take over. It's easier, it's faster, it's more efficient for me to just do it myself than it is for you to be allowed to be encouraged to accomplish the things that you can do. And then some of our programs are just not set up for that kind of person-centered approach. We have this set of fixes for this set of circumstances, and probably 7 out of 10 times it's not necessarily the right fix, or it is the right fix, and there's just those few times when they really want or need something else that the program standards or that the grant funding just doesn't allow for. And so those seeds of optimism and pessimism can be extremely difficult to get germinated and get started growing. So let's talk a little bit more about the difference in pessimism and optimism and what that looks like. If you want to go ahead. So I don't know, sometimes I use examples that dates, how old I am getting to be. And however, I think that the Winnie the Pooh series, there's a recent movie, probably not so recent now, it's 5, 6 years, who knows, has kept Winnie the Pooh books alive. But I think the epitome of the two ends of the spectrum of pessimism and optimism are definitely captured in the characters of Eeyore and Tigger in Winnie the Pooh. Making sure that we recognize that they are complete ends of the spectrum. Neither are completely representative of what would be considered functional behaviors, because if we look at Tigger representing resilience and optimism, he certainly has the optimism that he can do anything and everything is going to work out all the time, no matter what. He's the only one. He's bouncy, flouncy, trouncy, fun, 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 fun. He is the guy. And in many sets of circumstances, that can actually be a toxic personality. If you're the one who has all the solutions and no matter what, it's always you. Tigger has the access to social supports and the ability to recognize that negative behaviors don't last forever, but he doesn't necessarily have the ability to soothe and nurture himself depending on those negative emotions. He's just totally dependent on fun, sort of that self-gratification instead of self-reflection. On the other end of the spectrum is our buddy Eeyore. He is often used as the representative for depression. He certainly displays in a lot of cases what are the 5 classic symptoms of depressive disorders. He's down, depressed most of the day. He doesn't seem to have an interest or pleasure in activities. He's often fatigued or very reduced, low energy. He's often quoted as saying, "Could be worse. Don't know how, but it could be." And so these two extremes, these two opposites, really frame how well both employees and employers, as well as our customers, are impacted by the elements of change, whether it's healthcare, moving to the new city, the trauma that might be involved in an immediate healthcare crisis like a stroke, or learning of a diagnosis of Parkinson's or some other type of chronic illness. And in the initial research done in learned helplessness, there's been a direct line over the years that says in the same way that an individual becomes conditioned to think that nothing can change, they can also condition themselves to be optimistic, which I think is obviously very encouraging. But it seems too good to be true, right? It seems too simple. People don't actively look to become helpless. They just find themselves in those sets of circumstances based on the circumstances. And so I think they would often say, I didn't have a choice, or I didn't make this decision for myself. I just found myself here. But I think that the research is pretty strong that there are practical ways that if individuals are interested in investing the time and energy, and we as a helping profession assist in the way that we work with our clients, that it is absolutely possible. So go ahead, move to the next one. So when you think about Eeyore and his symptoms of pessimism, there are attributes to that pessimism that are pretty typical in the learned helplessness world, right? That events are always outside themselves. They didn't have any control over it. It's all happening to them. And as a result of things that they've done, they're not good enough. They didn't have the right this or that or the other thing. They don't have the right money. They don't have the right color skin. They don't have the right cultural background. They don't have the right education. And it's always the belief that bad things not only will happen now, but will also happen in the future. And if anything good does by accident in their mind happen to them, it is a mistake. Oh my goodness, something good happened to me, that just that can't be right. It's a fluke. And really, as we begin to think about making accommodations for our changes in life and looking at our resilience, things like language, and especially during the COVID, I thought one of the very specific language kinds of things matters in conditioning to pessimism. So the really practical example is the difference between telling someone they need to social distance versus physical distance. A social distance is, I need to stay away from people. I need to be separate and apart from any activities that involve people. I don't need to be social. Versus when I'm with people, I need to be sure that I'm 6 foot away from them. And those messages continue to influence people and how they viewed gatherings and how they viewed getting out of their house or getting together with others. And social distancing was really adopted earlier and really carried that negative connotation that people shouldn't be together at all, which would indeed contribute to that sense of greater isolation. And so it's just a really small example of how language contributes to the social conditioning that can be learned over time. And then it's adopted as sort of like the norm. And continuing and perpetuating the isolation and depression that may go along with it. And then reinforces the bad habits that a person might have, or not bad habits, but the habits that a person may have gotten into, like if they were trying to quit smoking, now they're back smoking, or they've been trying to cut down on the consumption of alcohol because they just know that that may not be good for the kind of medication that they take, but they can't seem to do it because they just don't have control over that, or they didn't see a way to become a part of a regular exercise because they didn't have access to digital technology. And we'll talk about some of those things in a few minutes. Or if a person, again, is trying to lose weight and believing that no matter what they do, they're just not going to be able to quit smoking, lose weight, or stop drinking. One good example is also those individuals who refuse or who are very reluctant and resistant to adopting public transportation. Many times a person will lose that capacity to drive, and then they're sort of like cut themselves off like a light to access to services, and because they're just unwilling to relearn how to use public transportation. I don't trust it. I've never done it. I can't do it. I don't have the capacity. I don't have the ability. I don't have the resources available to me to do that. And so navigators who really try to retrain folks on how to use public transportation is finds that is one of the overwhelming obstacles to getting people engaged. So let's look at it from the optimist outlook. What are those outlooks look like? And so some of those attributes are obviously a little bit more external than internal. Oh, the world is my oyster. Anything that happens just happens because it's sort of outside of my control, and I'm just a part of the process. And that means that anything positive could happen as well as anything negative. Negative attributes might be a little bit more internal. They may say, oh, I didn't make a good choice, or today I just didn't feel as good as I did yesterday. And so that may be a part of that. You feel that good things will happen in the future. You expect things to work out for the best. You feel like you're going to be able to succeed in life's challenges. The future is something that actually looks bright and not to be feared or avoided. You feel gratitude for the good things in your life. You're like, oh, not so much like the Eeyore, well, could get worse, but instead of like, well, today I have these things, I have a list of these 3 positive things in my life today. And you're really always looking for the opportunities to make the most of the opportunities that you have. And so you really want to, I want to say that I think I have an error on this slide, Caitlin. So we need to make a note to go back and make sure that we correct that, because I think that's the same list that was on the pessimist slide. I just recognized it.
Making a note.
Making a note. There we go. So the optimist would say, oh, silly me, we can fix it. The pessimist would say, oh my gosh, can you believe that I never get anything right? However, one of the things that is very possible in life is change. Change is the only thing that you can expect to remain the same, is that things will change. They say it about the weather, they say it about life, whoever they are. You can learn to flip the switch. And so when you begin to think, if you go to the next slide, about the opportunities that are in place, both in the workplace as professionals and the customers that we serve, striking that balance between the best outlook optimistically and the worst case scenario can be a real challenge. And again, it's that really creative soup that's made up of your own life experiences and that of the consumers and that of all the other people that are in the same place at the same time. And so the pandemic really gave the Aging Network and researchers fertile ground to look at innovation and explore what is possible when things are difficult, and how people did and do and continue to respond to very trying and challenging situations. And most of us and most of you saw the pandemic not only in the light of the negativity, but really as an opportunity to adapt to new ways of working. I don't know how many of us, some people were technology ready to flip to Zoom meetings and to video virtual meetings, and have sat and stared at screens for more hours than we care to count. And others were just knocking their head against the wall, trying to figure out how to get meals to consumers, and how to continue to deliver in-home aid, or to deliver doctor visits or emotional support to individuals in their homes, or by phone, or through drop ship deliveries. So it really created a canvas of opportunity for creativity. And as the pandemic fatigue continued to take over, I think we saw that initial positive creativity really begin to flip over to pessimism, frustration, and often a sense of passivity. When will this ever end? How are we going to get through it? This money will not last. What are we going to do? How are we going to face the end? What's it going to look like? All of those types of questions begin to plague the whole network pretty early days. And in many cases, there's still no answers to some of those questions. We're still unsure of even the funding situation as Congress now begins to look towards the end of the emergency situation in May of any unspent dollars that may be out there. What is going to happen to those? So lots of unanswered questions, which leaves those who feel a bit pessimistic in a very tough spot, and those who are a little bit more optimistic continuing to look for ways to develop and grow and move forward. So it really is an opportunity to begin to put into place some very specific activities, not only for ourselves, but for our clients, of moving from pessimism to what's considered to be pervasive optimism. So if you go to the next slide. So you might remember our little 3 Ps in a pod folk from earlier, and where pessimism was that sense of nothing right's going to happen and it's always going to be this way and it's everywhere. Pervasive optimism takes those 3 same Ps and says, well, hey, life is really not my fault or a result of who I am. It's just a matter of what I do as an individual to respond to the circumstances that come my way. And in a sense of pervasiveness is, oh my gosh, it's everywhere. Well, yeah, it's everywhere, but what can I do given the restrictions that I'm faced with, or given the opportunities that have shown up and are right available to me today? Don't have to necessarily worry about tomorrow, but just right today. And then in the P of permanence is that a person who's more optimistic is going to say, hey, this will pass. It'll be a new day tomorrow. Something different will happen. And while it's difficult right this minute, I can make it. I've made it before. I'll make it again. And I can learn to adapt. And it's that adaptability, that accommodation for changes that are made, that is often really the linchpin, because the adaptation is the action statement. So it moves out of just thinking into doing, into creating opportunities for oneself that are practical and possible to make a change in life and in thinking in general. So as you think about the workplace, again, often, if you want to move to the next one, often employers really may or may not have paid a lot of attention to their employees in the past. They may not have been focused on their emotional well-being as much as they might have been their performance. And I think now workplaces really have to be good about setting clear expectations about work, especially those who were able to work at home during the pandemic and still have some of that flexibility. You have to tell people, hey, don't skip lunch just because you're at your house, or go outside, get some fresh air, stand up and walk around. Don't sit at that desk looking at the computer, all the time. Or if you're in a field-based situation, take time to rest, sit down, take a moment for yourself, take time for lunch. Give yourself that break to be able to regroup and recharge your battery, especially giving permission to for individuals whose frustration level is high when working with consumers to be able to take a break and step back and reset before they have to engage again. Really encouraging everyone, regardless of workplace or not, to avoid what's been called doom scrolling. I love that word, doom scrolling, which is really that constant barrage of negative stories that come from all sources, whether it's social media or television or news outlets or radio or podcasting, whatever the source of the information, or just grousing with your neighbors over the fence, is that the more negative news and data that you take in, the less room for positivity there's going to be. And really beginning to look at the balance of what kind of information you're taking in and what you're doing with it, because especially if it's worldwide news, it's not a lot that we can do to influence the world. And so really being mindful and intentional about making sure that you're taking in as much positivity as you can. Encouraging employees to have good health and nutrition, of course, has always been a thing. But again, really setting an example or modeling that at work with, making sure, and we feed people a lot, and we feed a lot of comfort foods because people like comfort foods, but at the same time, we might need to model more fruits and vegetables or more healthy options when we have events. And then really making sure that we focus on wellness. One of the flips and phrases that I really like is that often reports about mental health issues are reported in 3 in 4 people. I'm sorry, that 1 in 4 people experience mental health challenges in the world today. Well, that's a statistic, obviously, but the flip of that statistic is 3 in 4 people have good mental health. And so we need to focus and be supportive to the 1 in 4, but that's not necessarily always the best way to frame it. You want to frame it in the wellness part of it. And often messaging in the workplace can be really difficult because we want to be sure that we're reducing stigma. There really are no emotional supermen. Everybody experiences some types of frustration all the time. And nobody is getting through any day unscathed. And I think if we all agree to demonstrate some of that vulnerability to each other, then there's a better sense of that we're all in this together. All right. So as we look to the other things that are in place to assist in helping to unlearn learned helplessness, the same Dr. Siegelman, who did the initial research on learned helplessness, has since written a book about learned optimism. And he really gives some fairly specific methods to begin to naturally respond to negative events in a more positive way. He gives very specific examples that are not unlike some of the things that we've learned to do in the workplace, setting SMART goals. So if you've been a part of any goal setting work at all, you know that anytime you're setting goals, they need to be following the SMART model, which is that goals should be very specific and measurable and achievable, realistic and timely. All of those things apply not to just work projects or plans, but also to personal goals that you might have. So instead of saying, oh, I want to lose weight, you may say, hey, by the end of September of 2023, I'd like to lose 20 pounds. And then think about the ways that you're going to measure that. I'm going to measure my food. I'm going to keep a journal. Is it achievable? Is it possible for me to do that? Are there things about my metabolism, or are there things about the way that I eat or the way that I shop or the way that I have access to food that might impact that? Is it realistic? Is 20 pounds too much? Is that too little? Should you Do you need to lose 100 pounds? God knows I do, but is that realistic? Yeah, probably not. But 20 pounds might be doable. And regardless of what the goal is, these are the kinds of frames that you want to put it. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a work goal, but even personal goals. So the book leans a lot on goal setting. And it also leans a lot on the ABC method of reframing negative situations. And it's really interesting because it's not just ABC, but it's like ABCD. And the example that he gives for these kind of things is that when you think about adversity, one example is that somebody rushes past you and bumps into you and knocks your drink on the ground. Oh, and your belief is what you say to yourself is, well, that person is pretty rude and selfish. And then the consequence of that is that you have this negative impact. You have this negative emotional thing that's going to really sort of stay with you, and you're going to germinate that throughout the day. And then the disputation is that, well, you recognize that, hey, those negative feelings are really not going to help you. So you tell yourself, hey, it's really not worth getting upset about. Don't cry over spilled milk, so to speak. It could be that you don't know the facts about what was going on with that person. They could be rushing to the emergency room or trying to handle a crisis or trying to overcome technology challenges to get to a webinar. Anything could be possible. And if you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, and that's going to help you in the long run so that you lean more on the facts and not just what your supposition is about the situation. And then in the I can't even say that, energization portion, then you give yourself credit for having taken control over your thoughts and successfully calmed your mind. You say, hey, good for me. I'm not going to let this thing overtake me because I've had this bad thing happen, whether it be somebody knocking your drink to the ground or cutting you off in traffic or opening the door for you when you didn't need the door opened, or, it could be a kabillion different examples. But walking yourself through the ABCD E's of circumstances intentionally can often trick your brain into thinking a different way about the set of circumstances. So I encourage those of you who are interested in learning more about learned helplessness and optimism to check out his book. Cognitive rethinking is also another aspect of flipping the switch from learned helplessness to learned optimism, or pessimism to optimism, and includes some pretty basic, it's been around since the 1950s, aspects of thinking. The psychologist Albert Ellis really identified this process as the ability to identify and really dispute irrational or negative thoughts, because they carry a high cost and a high impact on individuals, especially as you age, and of any age or any ability, sorry. And the steps in the process are pretty specific. You identify the situations that are triggering your thoughts. You really tap into the emotional feelings that you're feeling around that. You begin to look for and identify the thoughts that you're having in response to that. It's all very intentional. And then you look very much like the ABCDE for whether or not there's evidence to support the way you feel about something. And so many times we jump to conclusions, or we think we know what somebody's thinking, or we make those assumptions that, well, all people or all circumstances or every time that something. And of course, if you make a big old generalization like all people do this or every time something happens, most likely it's not true, because nothing happens in that type of absolute. And so if you begin to scale back and really look at the evidence to support what's making you think a particular way, then you're able to focus on the objective facts and really begin to replace those automatic negative thoughts with really more positive and realistic ones. And there's loads of tools out there, very practical tools that can help identify strengths even when they don't think they have them. Things like strength wheels, very much in the person-centered land of, who are those around you that support you, and are they truth tellers, that kind of stuff. Just loads and loads of it. We've got some of those resources in these slides, but really more so just in a general search. There's also current applications that give you some options around these kinds of ways of thinking and process steps as well. Some people get what are called messages from the universe, and they're just positive attributions every day that come to the email that says, you're the best, or, you've done something wonderful, or the world is here because you're here and all's going to be right with the world. Very positive affirmations. Some people have opt for optimism calendars on their desk where there's like a daily affirmation or a daily positive statement. And reading and ingesting those positive statements have a physical, emotional response in your brain. You can even trick your brain into thinking more positive by just smiling, even if it's a cheesy, fake smile. Your brain doesn't know the difference. It thinks, oh, okay, it's time to be happy because we're smiling. And so there are also, different schools of thought around meditation and yogurt and prayer if you're spiritual. All of those kinds of things are intentionally planting and planning for a seed of positivity for every single day. And really moving from learned helplessness to learned optimism is beginning to intentionally find ways to shift that thinking from one aspect of negativity so that you can opt for optimism. So the next slide, and we're almost done, is to really opt for optimism. So as you become more mindful and you practice gratitude and you begin to explore ways to go about increasing positive emotions and opportunities in your life, one of the best ways to do that is through things like a gratitude journal, or literally writing down a positive plan for the day or an optimistic plan for the day. And more and more and more, stay connected. If you were fortunate enough to see the webinar that's already been done, it's recorded in our archive, called Keeping Connected, Social Isolation, Loneliness in Older Adults, that had Sarah Maloney from the Administration on Community Living and Rebecca Freeman from the Division of Aging and Adult Services. That webinar is just full of resources around how to stay connected. And connection is a huge part of positivity, and especially when you're connecting with people who are positive and who are going to work with you to also be positive. Being mindful, being sure to engage and be attentive and be present in the here and now, grateful for what's going on right this minute, and really seeking professional help in those times where you feel that life is so out of control that any of these intentional kinds of interventions are not going to work for you, is always a good choice. There is no shame, and there's certainly no judgment in individuals who seek support from mental health counselors, social support, social workers, etc. So I know that we have 1 minute left, which is not enough time for questions, but we'll be happy to address questions, offline. Thank you for your attention, and I'm grateful for you and your time that you have spent with us today. I am also hopeful that you will take the intentional time to look for positivity in your own life and in your work with the consumers that you work with. And thank you for all that you do. And with that, Miss Caitlin, I think we're done.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Again, I know this is always the popular question. Yes, you will get the slides. Yes, it will be on our website. Yes, you will get a certificate of attendance. And I will email all of that information out to you guys. So we hope to see you next time. And thank you, Debbie.
You are welcome. It was my pleasure.